Hi, everybody. This is Timothy Cameron, aka the Incomplete Skeptic. Welcome to the show, The Incomplete Skeptic. I'm interviewing Tezikiah today, Tezikiah Gabriel, an esteemed fellow in ACIM and ACOL. For those of you who might not know what that is, A Course in Love and A Course in Miracles, where we met. She's been an inspiration to me and has helped a great many souls in her sacred journey, and it's my privilege to be able to bring her story to you and hopefully dismantle some of the cynicism in our society, get people to be a little more open-minded and compassionate with their perceptions of how they view the world, because we all know how difficult this world can be. But let's try to ease some of that up, and today we're going to have Tezikiah in our ballpark for accomplishing that mission. Tez, I'm going to call you Tez. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Great. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being willing to be my next victim as an interviewee. Hopefully I won't make you feel that way, and I'll ask intelligent questions rather than go in another direction. Don't want to set that up though, right? Well, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's an honor, really, Timothy. I'm glad to be here.
Great. You know, I think let's start this with some background on you so people get a big picture of what you're doing today and why. You know, I know you've spoken to the United Nations. I know that you've been involved in communities of healing in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul. I know there are other Twin Cities in our country. But if you care to touch on the big picture of what your life is and you know what you're doing on your sacred journey now, and then maybe we can delve into the whys and where the roots are from, you know, where that came from.
Sounds perfect. And please let me know if I'm going too long or you need to shift into a different direction. It's difficult to squeeze a long life into a small amount of time, and I'm going to do my best about that. So currently, I really have I see my life through the lens of kind of a three-legged stool. And in the middle of that is my sacred journey. And so all three of those legs of that stool are interconnected, with each informing the other. So I have run a consulting firm called Gabriel Associates for 29 years. And we work with nonprofit organizations. So in that work, I have the amazing honor of getting up every day and joining with folks who have chosen to make a difference in the world and help them do more and better with better outcomes. So I love that work. I still enjoy that work. It allows me to, even though it's somewhat at a distance, because I am a consultant, not a staff person, it still allows me to be able to have the 100-mile distant look on kind of what's happening in our world today, and what needs to occur, who's suffering, who needs healing, what organizations are doing, what the issues and trends are. And so even after 29 years, I find it amazingly exciting to be able to do that work every day. The other leg of my journey today is that I'm the executive director of a United Nations Peace Messenger organization called Pathways to Peace. And we do just a tremendous amount of work around the world, as well as have a visible presence at the United Nations. So in that work, I'm able to assemble delegates and conduct workshops and events that bring together others who have come to the United Nations to share their voice in a way that makes a difference. And then the other leg, which really is probably more the driver of my work than a separate entity, is that I've had a spiritual practice for 50 years. And that work really engages others in empowering the divine within. I really believe that spirit dwells within, that we are uniquely powerful as creators, and that oftentimes it's just a matter of remembering or becoming aware of all of the power, all of the glory that is, and all of the grace, really, that is our birthright. And so over the years, I've been able to blend those three amazing, privileged opportunities to be able to make a real difference in the world. And a long time ago, I realized that my purpose could be practiced through any vehicle. And so it's allowed me to just have a lot of experience and do a lot of things, because it doesn't matter if I was a nurse's aide or a cook or a waitress or being the executive director at the United Nations, that I could bring my purpose into that work and have a very beautiful and fulfilling life, and to be able to connect with others, like-spirited and otherwise, in making a difference in our world.
Well, thank you for elucidating the three-legged stool, and that's a great way to start this off. You know, I don't mean to project at all, but my experience has been anyone who is really on a sacred path of healing are like Oprah. You know, Oprah said we need to make our wounds our wisdom.
Yes.
So it's like most of the healers I've met in life have had something they needed to heal from themselves. A lot of us have been through the proverbial dark night of the soul. And, you know, I see you as someone who's embarked on the sacred feminine. And I like to think I've garnished a piece of that in my life as a sacred man, this, you know, the divine masculine in with balance of the divine feminine. I don't think a man is ever a complete man unless he balances out with the divine feminine.
Yes.
And, you know, anyone can misuse their power and go to the dark side. You know, you can be the divine feminine or the dark feminine, the divine masculine or the dark masculine. And so many of us get caught up in the dark side. But then there are those of us who go through the dark side and fall in love with everything that has happened in our lives, you know. And I'm going to use the G word, and not everyone's fond of it, but, you know, in God's economy, God is a G word. In God's economy, nothing is wasted. And my experience has been when I loved all the parts of myself that were misbehaving, it actually brought me to a place where the only thing that existed anymore was what was real. And it's like when I loved all the parts of myself that were difficult, they got weaker. And that's like counterintuitive. Well, what was it that you maybe organically powered through in your life? How did you end up on the healing side versus the wounded side? And how did you get unstuck, if that's even characterizing anything correctly? Correct me if I'm off track here.
Oh, I don't think you're off track at all. It's a big, long story. So let me see if I can unpack a few of those pieces. I just want to start by saying hindsight is 2020, of course. As I look back on my life, I recognize those choice points that either allowed me to become more of who I am intended to be, because that's what it's all about, right, Timothy? Is this journey we're on is really to become aware over time of our own true natures, who we were always intended to be, and actually always were, although we may not have recognized it. And so, so I certainly, as I listened to you, what I was reading into what you were asking is really, what are those experiences that kind of brought me into a greater awareness of who I am as a sacred expression of the divine? And I think there are many. And starting in my earliest childhood, I from the earliest time of awareness, I always felt that I had information that others, even the adults around me, did not have. And that information came to me through, in my child's mind, through something greater than myself, something very good. And I did use, or as soon as I had language for it, thought that that came from God or Jesus, because in my childhood history, that was the path that was most commonly known to me. Later in my adulthood, I've explored all kinds of sacred paths and have really just kind of soaked myself in that divine pool of sacred traditions and paths that have made my life so much richer. But from that early childhood, I always had that sense that I was here for some reason. I didn't know what it was, but that somehow I was special. And I think all children probably feel that to some degree if they've had the opportunity to. I lost my father, who was a pilot, in his own private plane crash when I was 2.5. I was very bonded to my father and not to my mother, because she had a difficult time having me and ended up being hospitalized for 2 weeks after my birth. In that amount of time, my dad took me up in his plane every day. And so while I did not bond with my mother, I was very deeply bonded with my dad. And when he died, it changed forever my mother, who eventually, when I was 12, died of a broken heart, a heart attack at 38. She never got over my father's death. She did remarry to a man who was abusive to her and to me. And she left. But during those years of growing up, because my mother really could not emotionally connect, what she did do for me, even though she couldn't hold me or hug me or even dress me as a small child, what she did do for me was to encourage my freedom. And I believe, and I've had conversations with her on the other side about this, I believe that she did that because she knew she was leaving and that I needed to be able to care for myself. And
just interrupt for a half a second here.
Sure.
What do you mean by the other side? I think I know what you mean, but maybe just say a couple words about that.
Well, however you choose to define afterlife. For me, it's simply being in the next dimension or in the next room, so to speak. And the relationships with those people that we've loved while they've been on this physical plane can continue. It's just like being in conversation. Some people would say on the other side of the veil. And so, of course, our loved ones there are fully whole. And so, regardless of what kind of relationship I had with my mother, which I can honestly say I really hated my mother, because at 2.5 and 3 years old, I know I thought she took away my father. And so I grew up just really hating my mother and not really knowing why. It just was there. And that now we have an incredibly loving relationship. She's whole and I'm whole. There was never any forgiveness of her because she did nothing to be forgiven for. She did the best she could with what she had to deal with. And so she encouraged my independence and my freedom, which meant that I had a very happy childhood. I was able to do whatever I wished to do. I'd say I was a very unstoppable child. And even if she had tried to control me, I think that would have been a pretty challenging thing. I was fiercely independent. I loved my freedom. I loved being a child in the natural environment, being in the woods, being connected to nature and animals and my friends, being in the summertime on the lake and in the lake, and just really having the freedom to do whatever I chose to do. And she would encourage that, including taking me where I needed to go, including this fascination I had with religious institutions. So I loved, even though I think my mother, she was from the Deep South, I would say that what rings true for me was that she was Southern Baptist, but I could go to the Lutheran Church, the Mormon Church, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Catholic Church. I loved the statuary. And I made, from the time I was really young, I was able to kind of experience all of those religious traditions. And I was just fascinated by all of them. And again, at some level, I always felt connected to the sacred in whatever way I could, given I was a child. And at the same time, I realized that not everybody got information channeled to them in the same way that I did, and that I didn't need to share that with folks. So I didn't talk about that to anyone growing up. And actually, just so that I could tune it out, I developed some pretty amazing coping mechanisms, like always hearing music in my mind so that I could go to sleep, because the information I was getting and what I knew, it was very difficult as a young child to tune it out. I have those tools now, and I'm trying to unpack some of those less healthy coping mechanisms I developed as a child so that I can get the information that's useful for me to have when it's respectful for me to get it. And when others are wanting it from me. and that it's a loving thing to give it,
Sure.
that I can do that.
Let me hop in here just a moment. I don't want to break the continuum by any means. It's great. But for those few people, I know that there are some people that don't like the term channel. I think there's some people that think it's from the dark side or something like that. For me, it's just another word. You remember the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, for example?
Yes.
He said, Lord, make me an instrument of your mercy and your peace. But in some places it says, Lord, make me a channel of your instrument, as your instrument in peace. So he was a channel. He was a channeler. And when we're praying and God answers that, that makes us a channel, right?
Yes.
So I just would hope, as the incomplete skeptic, that we would drop some of the judgment on that word and be at peace with what people are saying and listen to the Spirit rather than what we've been taught, maybe in our various disciplines.
Yes. And I have to say that I'm really aware of kind of the new age buzz terms that turn people off. And I try myself not to use those, or to use those in conjunction with other more universal words, because what's most important is not, the gifts we have, because we all have them. Some of us are a little more aware of some than others, but we all have them, and we all have the same ability through, again, our birthright as an expression of the divine. It's just that what's most important, really, and Scripture says this, is love. And we can only kind of express love in relationships. So what's more important to me than anyone knowing that I get information or that I had some gifts, because we all do, is that we can enter into communion where we can have a conversation that is based in really love and acceptance of who we are as unique human beings having a sacred journey here, and that we can let go of all judgment and just seek understanding. To be able to speak our own truth and listen for understanding is really the greatest gift we can give ourselves or give each other.
Right on.
Relationship.
I really appreciated how you talked about coping mechanisms. And, children, young people are kind of left on their own when they're sensitives, or if they're deep intuitives, whatever you want to call it, channelers, and I don't think a lot of people talk about those coping mechanisms out loud. They're very quiet about them because they seem so personal, but I really appreciated how you were describing them and listening to the music and things like that. So maybe if you wanted to kind of take off where you were at, we could continue that.
Yeah,
or wherever you want to take off from.
I think that as young children, and I see this especially, I am a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother. And so I have the distinct pleasure of seeing my own young family members coming in with these incredible gifts. And they're coming into their families with a greater acceptance of those gifts. So there's less need for them to kind of be secretive. Although even my young grandchildren and great grandchildren, who I've known since their birth, of course, and have watched them as they've talked about their gifts, even they, when they went off to school, kind of stopped talking about the gifts that they had. I'm thinking of one of my granddaughters who, from the time she could talk, talked about talking with angels and spirits. And then when she went off to school, and we all, of course, her parents and myself, would allow her to talk about those things, and we would hear her and not react negatively. But when she went off to school, she kind of stopped talking about those things. And so I think even though there's more openness, and I'm seeing with my great-grandchildren, the ability to hang on to that sense of themselves as sacred beings with gifts longer, there's still that cultural kind of taboo, I'll say, around being different. And so I am a very old soul. I'm aware of that. I know I've been here many, 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 many times. Had many have chosen to incarnate here on the planet. Many more recent lifetimes, but I've been here a long time. And so for me as a young child, I just intuitively knew that I was different and that I couldn't tell people about what I knew, that it would make them uncomfortable. And as a young child, relationships were very important to me. I wouldn't use that term, but I loved my friends, and I was a leader and of our neighborhood pack, and I loved my time with my friends and didn't wish to be labeled as different. So I just didn't talk about it. And that became a lifestyle. I remember recently someone that who gained some intimate knowledge of my life said to me, it must be very difficult for you because who can you even talk to about these things? And what occurred to me and what I said is that I have been very comfortable with not talking about these things my entire life, because way deep down, which has now come to the surface in very big and glorious ways, is that I wish my role here to be one of just being love. And I can't express that other than in relationship. So that has become more important than anyone kind of knowing, quote unquote, who I am in the deepest levels of my soul. Because you know what? I know who I am, and Divine Source knows who I am. So I don't need others to know that.
Right. It's, you know, in some of my speeches, I think this is supportive of your general idea. I'll say something that the Buddha had said about when the student is ready, the teacher appears. But it's like I'm in charge of what I say, others are in charge of what they hear. And they could hear everything right, even if I say it all wrong, or they could hear it all wrong, even if I say it all right. It's not about right and wrong. It's how we perceive it. It's what filters we have on. So, but if I've surrendered my life and my heart, my mind, my intellect, my emotions to my higher power, then everything comes out right. But no matter what words we apply to it, the words aren't the things that we're saying.
Yes.
So how people even get there, how they intuit the meaning of a thing is on them. You know, we have our filters, and my filter isn't my filter. And now I have friends that say I have no filter, and I try not to. I've worked on that quite a bit. But but yeah, I identify with that to some extent. I know that having looked at your astrological chart and the like, and my intuition said that, we knew each other in different lives, and I, I view past lives
Yes.
differently than you, perhaps. I think they're all happening simultaneously in the here and now,
Yes.
different dimensions, but those are just words.
Yes.
Who cares, right?
That's right. That's right.
But we both have a moon in Aquarius, and you went to be a leader, and I've always been pretty much not a leader until I
Mhm.
got older, and then I started to kind of change that. But I stayed quiet almost 100% because the messages I was receiving as a young person is that, and I bought it to some extent, and to some extent I couldn't, is that men don't cry. You're
Mhm.
not a man, you're not a male if you express your emotions through your tears. And now I know tears are holy water,
Mhm.
but I think my sensitive nature was repressed or oppressed, and I was too young to defend myself, but I wasn't too young or old or anything to know that they just didn't understand me. But yet I kind of took a victim mentality, and I had to let that go when I got older. So what do you think helped you turn the corner to connect with the wounded people? How old were you when you
Mhm.
started doing that? Or am I making too much of a leap in the chronology here?
No, no. For me, it was always there. And so my own desire always, for whatever reason, perhaps I think probably I came in with it, was to always um, to both see and wish to heal. Um, that, of course, wasn't my childhood words, but in retrospect, in my childhood, I was always seeing what people would call the underdog and always taking those folks under my wing. And because I was a leader, I could play a role in assisting their integration into our group or into a place where they weren't being bullied or victimized.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was just always there. And so as it evolved, as I evolved in age, um, that became very evident in many ways. So I'll just give you a couple of examples in that when my mother died, I was left with a stepfather that was both physically and sexually abusive. I never felt that I was a victim because I always felt like I was competent to take care of myself. And I really took great action, that I was aware that he in his weakness, I knew he was a weak man, and that in his weakness he wanted to break my spirit. That was his framework, and I knew he could not do that. And so one occasion, again in the middle of the night, I was between 12 and 13, I sat up in bed and knew something was wrong. We had an attached garage, and I walked through the house, opened our door to our garage. My stepfather was trying to kill himself by having the car running in the garage. So I went over to him, and I on the window and said, "Come inside now." He turned off the car and came inside. And it's just amazing to me today that given, I just really, and I know this is just hard to believe, but I perceived him as weak. I did not perceive him as evil. And without any thought whatsoever, I saved his life. Some months later, again, in the middle of the night, woke up and could hear a ruckus in our living room, and went out and found him beating a woman that he had brought home, slamming her head against the floor. And so I pulled him off of her, said, "Stop now." I said to her, "You need to leave. You need to leave now." And she did. And so that kind of inherent, I'll say, because there wasn't even a choice involved, that inherent kind of desire to act in the face of that kind of situation was just always with me, and still is. I did a little stint, because in my consulting practice, every once in a while, I go in and do interim positions in nonprofits, just because I want to stay grounded in the inner workings of the nonprofit. If I'm going to be a consultant, I think it's important that every once in a while I get a good dose of what it's like to be inside the organization. And so I took this stint with one of my clients where I was the principal in an African-American alternative high school. And, the same sort of response would occur when the fights would break out. And I'm 5'2½", so most of my students were much larger than I was. And we had regular fights that would break out. And without even thinking about it, I was in the middle pulling kids off of each other and saying, "Stop now." And so for whatever reason, an inherent, it's not even a desire, an inherent call to act was there. Now, I do have a lot of compassion for people who have had rough patches, rough situations in their lives. As a very young adult, a young mom, I was married at 16, had 2 children at 17, 3 at 21, and 4 at 25. So I have experienced in my lifetime great poverty, homelessness, oppression, systemic oppression. And so certainly, and my mother used to say, she was a great influence around this. She would say, "But for the grace of God, there go I." And I've always been able, and this is empathy, of course, but I've always been able to see myself in that person's shoes, whether they are incarcerated or trying to re-enter the community, or homeless on the streets, or, unable to care for their families in the way that their families deserve to be cared for, or poor, or uneducated, because I dropped out of school at 12, entered back in and got my GED later, but I was out working to take care of my half-brother when I was 12. And so I just think I can see myself in all of those situations. And I know that how easy it is to find yourself in that situation, or to be born into a situation where you have much less opportunity to succeed. So I have that heart. I walk around with that heart of compassion for everyone who is in those situations, and know that that's not, I mean, there's a little bit of choice perhaps, but overwhelmingly, the situations have been out of that individual's or that family's or that child's control. So I have a heart and some compassion for all those who are struggling.
Well, as an ex-convict out for 29 years and sober for 29 years, there's a definite connection. But I was grateful to hear the work that you've done in the past and that you're doing now.
Mm-hmm.
I felt some acceptance, and that was a beautiful thing. What, you talked about the music that you would hear in your head, but I'm going to kind of do a segue, use that as a segue into maybe the here and now, as far as like music that gives you relief, or that maybe elevates your vibration, or however you want to put it. I mean, I have favorite songs and favorite musicians. Michael Monroe is like my favorite musician. Life is a Mystery is one of my favorite songs by him, Summer Rain. But Mraz did 93 Million Miles. I listen to that when I need to be uplifted, or Happy by Williams. I think his name is Phelan Williams, not sure. Geez. But
Farron.
what do you have?
Yeah.
Farron, thank you.
Yeah.
I guess I was in Egypt again or something. Yeah, Farron. There's probably still a connection. But do you have any music that is your go-to place now that, brings you some peace, or maybe some poetry, or, literature? Where do you go? I mean, I know you're spontaneous and of the spirit and all that, but just wondering where, any favorite music, poetry, literature?
Well, I love it all, because I think, we are fully emotional beings, and holistically, it is mind, body, and spirit. And so I'm very eclectic in my music. When I was at the UN 2 weeks ago, I hosted and coordinated the first time all day gathering for next gen peace builders, so young peace builders. And before we did our day, I said, okay, we're putting on Lady Gaga, Edge of Glory. And I love to dance. I never feel more connected to the divine than when I am singing and dancing and drumming and doing power songs. And for me, I think our culture has so limited the appropriate venues for connecting with the divine. So I love all of the ways we can break out of those artificial walls that have kept us nice little spiritual people. And instead to open wide the doors and to connect heart, mind, body in joy. And so anything that will do that for me, and all of it does. And so, yes, I love all music from the sacred. I love James Twyman. I think some of his very first albums, with prayers from around the world, just is beautiful. At the same time, I love Lady Gaga and all of the, and even rap, and hip hop, and I love the blues, the old blues, where we pull up our navy blue blanket and can just be blue, as well as I love the Beatles, and some of their music just transports me in terms, especially of the lyrics that just recently, all you need is love, let it be, Mother Mary comes to me. I mean, that just tells me that when it comes to all of those forms of art, that there is a direct connection there that we can tap into, that lifts up our creator selves in creation with the divine, and honors all different ways that we can connect.
When I appreciate that, I think it's important for the listeners to get that insight that you just shared with us. And I think most of us acclimate to music or whatever it is to bring more peace into our lives and maybe pass some of that on. But I remember in early recovery, and you reminded me of this actually, I came across a book that quickly became one of my all-time favorite books, titled Came to Believe. And in the 12-step program, they have the second step, which is came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And in that book, it came from the vantage point of every type of faith or non-faith, how they came to believe with a power greater than themselves. And it didn't have to be limited to anything. It's just a power greater than ourselves. And I loved that. And the different stories that were in that book shared by people, it's just like everything was lovable and embraceable. And when I came into 12 steps myself, I didn't exactly feel lovable. Drove under the influence, killed somebody's child, and abused as a child myself, and just all these things that happened in my past, nobody cared about. Nobody made me fill out a form to make sure that I fit in all the correct criteria. And,
Exactly.
they just said our principal purpose is to help the still suffering, in this case, alcoholic, and that we didn't do judgment, and they loved me until I could love myself, which took years, by the way, to really open that floodgate of love. So I don't know if you've heard of this author, but Ian Barber, he wrote a book that I read in prison when I was in the Missouri prison, and it was titled Myths, Models, and Paradigms. And he won the Templeton Award for bridging, erecting the bridge of faith and connecting it to the shore of science and vice versa. And he pointed something out that has impacted my life since from that point forward. But he drew a simple Venn diagram. He had one circle being religion and the second circle being science. And he said that they both have their own language, the language of religion, the language of science. But like every circle between every human being, there is an overlap. It might be a small overlap and it might be a large overlap, but that common space in between the two circles is where mutual language exists. And if we're only speaking the language of religion or the language of science, we're never having a conversation until we get into that center zone where we do have some mutual language. And that opened up something within me to where I would listen for that common zone, no matter where I was at, with whoever I was at, even when I was very narrow-minded, even when I was still caught up in a lot of my pain, that part of me was free though. And you know, when you go to that sacred place of you know, connection, and you keep feeding it slowly but surely, that connection gets wider and wider and wider, and you learn a newer and newer and more comprehensive language, and it doesn't like just make the other two circles disappear. They don't have to, but it expanded my soul slowly but surely. So that's what hearing your music, your choice of music, your choice of literature, but you didn't mention a poet per se. Do you have a favorite poet?
I have to say that in my early days, you know, I'm a founder of the battered women's and sexual assault movements here in Minnesota, and then resurgence of the restorative justice movement as well many years later. But in the mid-70s, after the civil rights movement, again, I was deeply involved there, deeply involved in the anti-war movement. And then in the resurgence of the feminist movement, I became the founder of those offshoots for battered women and sexual assault. And I got to meet so many amazing sheroes in that time period, including, you know, the names that everyone knows, like Gloria Steinem and others who were at that point making the rounds in those movements, because those were new movements. But of all of them, the poet I most appreciated was Audre Lorde. And there are some of her quotes. Well, I love Rumi as well, but for different reasons. So Audre Lorde's quotes really did drive my work to end systemic oppression and create places where peace and justice could thrive. And one of my favorite quotes of Audrey's, and she has amazing poetry. Of course, oh gosh, now I'm thinking of all these other poets. Maya Angelou, of course, who just, seeing Maya Angelou in person was like the most spiritual and sacred activity I've ever experienced in, as she read her poetry and then would burst into this beautiful song, and the emotionality of Maya Angelou. Oh my God. But Audre Lorde, going back there, one of the quotes that still resonates with all of my work is, she said that you cannot dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. That has so stuck with me, that you cannot end violence with violence. You cannot end abuse with abuse. And so that has really informed all of my work through these years. And Rumi, there's a number of Rumi quotes that I absolutely love and do inform my work in my life daily. One is the one everyone knows, which is, there is a place beyond right and wrong. I'll meet you there. Usually it's a field beyond right and wrong. I'll meet you there, which really speaks to this really significant role of non-judgment when it comes to being able to experience loving relationship with all. And then the one that's more recently really impacted me is, there is only one sound, all the rest is echo.
Ooh, that's beautiful.
Isn't that beautiful? And so true. And Maya Angelou, of course, so many, Martin Luther King too, But Maya Angelou was, people will forget what you say. People will forget who you are, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And so I would say that the poetry, again, just like my eclectic notion, I'm looking over at my books. I have so many books. But for me, whether it is hearing music or whether, and I'm just really realizing this in this moment, or whether it's the beauty of poetry, is it causes me to act.
You start talking poetry and I got cats swirling around my feet now, so it's like, okay, we got some fellow poets here.
Yes.
Probably it feels the
Well,
energy changed in the room. That was inspirational.
Yes.
Go
so
ahead.
It inspires me to act, and then it reminds me. So it's not just beautiful to my ears, and it doesn't just resonate with my heart, even though it does those things. It really causes me to act and to remember the principles underneath that action. And you talked about earlier, there were a couple things I wanted to respond to, Timothy, even though we're probably running out of time. But when you were talking that, I was reminded of when you talked about the Venn diagram with science and spirituality. You know me well enough to know that's a particular passion of mine, is where those two meet. I'm heart math certified. And of course, the math tells us, heart math, all the research tells us that we not only can create a difference in ourselves, but that every time our heart beats, it sends out a signal in the field at least 3 feet, and then it interacts with the fields of others and lifts them, or not, dependent on the emotion behind that heartbeat. And so if I am choosing to express love, then every time my heart beats, it sends out a signal that will influence others in the field at least 3 feet all around me. That's the limitation.
Sometimes more, right?
Instrument. It's about being able to measure it. There's a limitation that they can only measure out 3 feet with the current instruments.
Got it.
Yeah, but this is how we create peace in the world, is that we create it in ourselves. And when you talked about, we know quantum physics, we know that time is occurring on all different levels, just as you said. These dimensions are running concurrently. So the science is verifying what we as spiritual people know to be true. And I just delight in that. I'm forever curious to learn more about that.
I wish I could bring this one painting up right now. It reminds me of what you're saying in so many ways. When I worked at Hazelden, which is a treatment center, I was walking through one of the hallways and there was this piece of art that I just instantly adored. It's of a man in a rowboat, and he's rowing this boat, and the ripples coming out from the boat are in the shape of a heart. The ripples are going out in the shape of a heart, and it's so beautiful. It inspired me, and but I remember a few times where I could feel that love expanding outside of me and seeing how it affected other people.
Yep.
And there was a time where I went to jail after I was sober. I was going through a divorce and I didn't realize I had missed a court hearing. So I was actually arrested for missing the court hearing. And I can't remember what they call it. When you miss it and the judge orders that you you know.
Mhm.
But in any case, the sheriff came and got me and came to my house, and I was managing a sober house at the time, and he walked into the room and he allowed me to change whatever I wanted to do. I mean, we're talking about a divorce hearing, not a felony or something.
Right.
And he looked around and he said, you know, I think this is the most peaceful place I've ever been in,
Yeah.
ever. And it was
It's
just like my room, but I set it up as a refuge of peace and healing.
yes.
And, but I was kind of bummed out about getting arrested and ending up in the Hennepin County Jail. And I couldn't figure out why I was back in jail again. And I got so depressed about it. I had even contemplated suicide. You know, it's like,
Hmm.
man, I didn't bargain
Hmm.
for this. And I was depressed
Hmm.
going through the divorce and some other things going on in my life. But then I had a wake up call. I was in a holding cell with probably 10, 15 other guys. And they were all talking about why they were there. It was almost like a 12-step meeting, really, because one person on the side of the room to my left started talking, and then they just went around the entire circle, you know,
Uh-huh.
of people saying why they were there and how they were abusing drugs and alcohol and their lives had disintegrated. And it was just crazy. And as it was coming closer to my turn to speak, I'm sorry, I'm going to say it that way, I thought, geez, you know, I think I'm going to say something about being in recovery. And when I'm sitting down in the corner of that cell, and I started to say, you know, I've been sober X number of years, and my life got better. And as I started speaking, I could see that the light in the room was getting brighter, and I thought it was because it was like maybe getting to be later in the day, and I didn't know what time it was, and maybe the lighting automatically gets brighter because everywhere because it's getting darker outside. And then as I'm talking, I was kind of startled to realize that the light was coming from where I was, and it went into the entire room, and I could feel everyone else in the room that it touched. And after I got done talking, each and every one of those people said, well, maybe I need to be sober. And they all started giving messages of hope.
Yes.
And they started using a language that they didn't use when they first talked. And
Mhm.
then I realized why I was really there. I wasn't there because I missed a court hearing, you know, and we think we are in a place for one reason, but really why we are there when we surrender our lives is totally different.
Yes.
And I'll never forget that experience, but that's kind of like the ripple message, you know, and we've both
Yep.
probably experienced that somewhere, right?
We do. I
Um,
mean, think about, you know, if someone in a group is having a bad day and you walk into the room, you're going to feel it right away.
mhm, mhm,
And the same is true when there is someone, and I know this has happened with you, Timothy, and I'm sure many others out there, and certainly me too, that people will hug you and say, "Oh, I just feel so peaceful when I'm in your presence."
mhm,
And so it's a felt response.
mhm.
And what I found about that, I always thought that I had to work on that, you know, what I to be that presence. And now I realize that that's who we are inherently. And even if I think I'm being really cranky, I woke up really cranky, you know, which happens, that people will still feel a positive presence that transcends my little situational crankiness.
Right,
And
right.
so, yeah, it's just, it's a felt experience. And the other thing I wanted to say is just, you know, I have said this before, but you know, the ancient texts tell us that there are three ways to be in communion with spirit, with God, with divine source, with Buddha, whoever you choose. And One is prayer, which is where you're talking to that divine source. The other is meditation, where that divine source is invited in to talk with you. And then there's conversation, which is back and forth. And so I like to live in that conversation. And even though we have divine within, it's still a comfort to me to be able to have that conversation with divine source, within, without, around, however you choose to see it. And the other thing I wanted to say, that something earlier reminded me of this, Timothy, is that we live in a time where we really recognize that it doesn't matter what faith, tradition, or religious path you take, because universal principles are universal. They show up across all sacred texts throughout all time. And so it really doesn't matter how we choose to express our own connection to divine source. We just need to express it with gusto. We need to express it with joy. We need to express it as our own, because we are it.
A woman to that, sister. I appreciate the conversation that the Holy Spirit has used us for today. And hopefully our friends that are listening to this conversation have had their hearts touched, and maybe their minds and open-mindedness expanded just a little bit more. Maybe we gave someone some hope in some way, shape, or form. And usually before speeches, I'll ask God to make me an instrument of mercy and peace and help someone, even if that someone is only me. I'll take it. Or the cat, or the puppy, or a tree. And when you gave the Rumi quote and some of the others, I'm going to go back and explore those, by the way. But the Rumi quote about there not being a right place and a wrong place, and I'll meet you there and in the field. But for some reason, I thought of a forest fire in the forest. The forest isn't complaining about the fire. It's just burning the forest down, maybe, or part of it. But then we know historically that that's what forests do, and it actually helps the new layer of life and growth to come up healthier, and it's part of the natural thing for us too, if you will. Just making the connection between the forest, and some people can't see the forest for the trees, but we are the forest, we are the trees, and once we're able to recognize the commonality, then we can see both in their perspective. But I remember when I was a kid, and I was really disturbed by this, is I saw a commercial, and it said, what was that, Smokey the Bear? Yeah, Smokey Bear said, only you can prevent forest fires. And I stayed up all night worried about that, because only I can prevent forest fires? What about everybody else? Just me? Okay, it's a Stephen Wright joke. I stole it. Just kidding. But
it's a good one.
Yeah, right. And Bill Hicks said that somebody was upset with him about saying something about religion during his routine, and people wearing crosses. And when Christ comes back and he sees the cross, he says, yeah, that's what I want to see, is another cross, right? And the guy was offended at that, and he was wearing a cross. And so Bill Hicks says, well, forgive me. Right? So if he would have forgiven him before he was asked to forgive him, then they would have never had that offense happen in the first place. And forgiveness always runs deeper than the offense that requires its presence. But in spiritual maturity, we end up in that middle place where there is no offense. We are no longer offended no matter what happens. We take our power back.
That's right.
And that beautifies us. And that to me is a good explanation and maybe a good stopping point to our interview. So thank you, Tezikiah. If you would like to share your website link, why don't you do that real quick? I can also put it on, when I share it as well, but let's get that for
Well,
people.
I have two, of course.
Okay.
Three counting the spiritual one, but I'll give you the two that will give you the closest access to me. One is Tezikiah, Tezikiah at Gabriel-consult.com. And the other is Tez, Tez, at Pathways to Peace, all one word spelled out, lowercase, .org. And I'll just close by thanking you, Timothy, for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts, some experiences, and I guess I would like to let everyone know that, regardless of where you are on your path, you are divine. And if we can, just lighten up a little.
Right?
Laugh a little bit more. And recognize that you're exactly where you need to be, doing exactly what you need to be doing. And to allow yourself grace and ease. That's what I would close with. So
Awesome.
thank you.
Awesome.
You're
welcome.
Wonderful.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in to The Incomplete Skeptic. And remember, I always say this, if you don't tell at least 3 people a day that you love them, you've probably wasted a day of your life. We're not all on the same ship, or we're not all in the same boat, but we're on the same ship. But row your boat in peace. I love you all. Thanks again for tuning in. Peace out. Thanks again, Tez. Bye-bye. I love you.
Love you too, Timothy. Bye-bye.